Hey folks, Wes here. I just launched my brand new website. It's available at wesboss.com. And I wrote a blog post kind of talking about the tech and everything like that. But thought I'd take you along for a little bit of a ride to see what I actually did under the hood. There's some cool stuff in it, I think, and it's totally open source. Maybe you can learn a thing or two about it. So let's check it on out. So, first of all, sorry I'm so blown out. I just moved into this new office and I'm not totally set up with lighting and everything like that. I literally just have a bulb hanging above me right now, which is why it looks so goofy, but who cares? So let's get into it. First thing, it's built on Gatsby JS. That's a React framework for building static sites. It's pretty cool because it's not like your standard just HTML and then that's it. It's HTML rendered, but then it picks it up as a React application once you load the page. So you can do things like go from page to page really quickly without having to reload the page. You can do things like you can go to the About page, and on there you can just embed React components right inside of it. It's pretty nifty. So that's why I chose that. There's also sort of another one, Next.js, which I use for a lot of my own course platform, and I'm a big fan of that. And they have also recently rolled out static generation per page, which is pretty cool because with Gatsby you got to go all in on static generation, whereas Next.js you can sort of go page by page, or you can part of your website can be static, part of it can be dynamic, which is pretty nifty. The reason I didn't do that is because I started this website way before that existed. And also I find the plugin infrastructure for Gatsby is really, really good. So you need something, just grab a plugin, very much like WordPress in that regard. Speaking of WordPress, I moved off of WordPress. I was on there for probably 10 years. My old website was, I don't know, I think it was 2014 I rolled it out, which is pretty long ago. I still like WordPress, but I wanted to move to Gatsby, which you can still use WordPress with. And second, I wanted all my blog posts to be in Markdown so that people could edit them and be able to get the content for them. So that's why I kind of moved entirely away from that. The new site is fast as heck. Big fan of how fast it goes. Like, I'm not tooting my own horn there. I literally did nothing to make it fast. It just is fast right out of the box, which is pretty cool. So let's talk about styles. I used styled components for all of my styles. And the way that I sort of attack style components is I do all of my global styles. So things like fonts, things like variables. I used lots and lots of CSS custom properties or CSS variables in the thing. I use them a lot for things like this, where if you want to change something at a media query, this little black border around the entire website is 40 pixels. And then that size is calculated right here. And then I use that like all throughout the website. And when I want to change that, I simply just need to pop a media query in, change that one variable, and then everything else just snaps to. Like, let me show you. I'll open up my dev tools here, go to the mobile boy. Here we go. And then once you hit that breakpoint, you see how it gets smaller, right? Like, that's so easy with CSS variables. Big fan of that. That's kind of what I do. I like to do all of my global styles, all of my typography all at once in one big thing. And then I'll go from component by component. So maybe if I open up the post template, I'll probably have some styles in here. Post header styles. Where is that defined? That is in its own component. So open that up. I make a styled header, and then I really like that because it automatically scopes everything, and then you can just go ahead and use like an H1 selector. You don't have to add a custom class to that because it's only going to be scoped to that specific header. And then I don't go overboard with styled components. Some people would like this post meta, which is this right here. Some people would make that another totally different component. That's way too much for me. So I much rather just use like descendant child selectors, just regular classes added to the thing, and then able to select it. So I still get the benefit of scoping, but it's not like too much heavy lifting in terms of Absolutely everything is a component. Um, the nav layout was kind of fun to do. So if you take a look at the nav that we have here, you'll see that as soon as they wrap onto the second line, they get smaller and they lose their top and bottom. Uh, I call it either just small tags in the header there. And the way that I do that is I wrote a custom hook that um, whenever it resizes itself using resize observer right here, whenever it resizes itself, then it will check which row it's on. So what this does is it figures out if the offset is less than the last one, which means that it's on the new row, and then it assigns it a row. And then in CSS, I can just apply different styles based on what row they're on. And that works with grid and flexbox, and it'll work with anything. It's a little bit janky if you like, you see that, you can, sometimes you can get it into a spot where, yeah, you see how like the small one went up on the second line. And the problem that I had there was that by making it small, it made it small enough to fit back on the first line, which made it style different, which made it bigger, because it got bigger to fit on the first line, it was too big to fit on the first line, which kicked it down to the second line, which then made it smaller, which then gave it enough room to go back on the first line. And that was just an infinite loop. And that's a problem that we'll have with content queries at some point, where these things will just constantly loop. So I ended up, not sure if this is a great idea or not, but it worked for me. I ended up only giving it 2 like renders. Here we go. If the renders is greater or equal to 2, then go ahead and do it. Sorry, if the renders is greater or equal to 2, then just stop until the next time that the person resizes that thing. Otherwise, they're just going to constantly go. And because of that, if you resize it, you can catch it on in like a weird state. And I've had like 100 people email me about it already. But if you were to just visit the page on this size, it goofed up there. Okay. Almost always, if you visit the page, it will look good on whatever page it's on. And that's fine with me. It's just people that are trying to catch it at a certain width or something like that. I'll probably revisit that at some point, but I'm pretty happy with how that works right now. Next up, we have custom layout. So in order to keep this right here, like the layout and the footer has my latest tweets, my latest Instagrams, the podcast, all of that data is fetched on page load. And you'll see that when I refresh it, it's empty. And then it sort of gets pulled in as the page loads. And then if I go to another page, like the tips page, that data is not refetched. It's there. And in order to persist that layout from page to page, I had to use Gatsby API called wrap page element. And that will allow you to persist components from page to page, which is pretty cool. So I made this layout component here. And the layout component contains the global styles, the fonts. I use this component called React Helmet, which is from the NFL. Super cool. And React Helmet will allow you to do side effects, things that need to go in the head of your document, like the title and short codes and meta theme color. That's for Android, things like that. And then this is the children right here. That's the actual content of the page. Everything else is the same from page to page. The blog posts and the hot tips are in Markdown or MDX. So if I take a look at new website MDX, you'll see that I'm allowed to write my posts in Markdown. I can specify a little bit of front matter here. Although I was thinking the other day, One of the benefits of using MDX instead of just regular Markdown is that it's a JavaScript file that has Markdown in it. So you can export things from MDX files. So I'm asking myself, why am I not exporting the title, the slug, the image, the categories, and the date? And why am I using front matter? I don't know. That's a good question I have. So maybe I'll switch that at some point. Although it is nice just to like write this code in here instead of having to write export variable whatever. The benefit of using MDX over just regular Markdown is that you can use JavaScript directly inside of these files. So if I wanted to pop like a YouTube component inside of there, and I have a global YouTube component, if you have a chart, if you have any React component you want to embed right inside of your Markdown file, you can go ahead and do that, which is pretty cool. What else? The Instagrams was pretty cool. So I'll start with the stories. So Instagram stories are not available via the API in Instagram. They are available if you are a brand and you get approval from Facebook, but I'm not. I'm just a regular person. So what I did is I figured out that I can take my Instagram cookie from being logged into Instagram.com on the browser. I just went into DevTools and found my the cookie for the session, and then I pinged this URL right here, which is the GraphQL endpoint for my account. And if you ping that with your own cookie, it will just think that you're logged in and give you back all of your stories and stuff. So obviously that cookie has to be in environmental variables because I can't put that. This is, I should note, this is a serverless function. This is running on the back end because I couldn't put my cookie in the front end. Otherwise anyone could log into my Instagram account. So this is a quick little serverless function. This is the first time on my own personal website that I use serverless functions. And it was awesome for little things where I just needed to quickly ping a server, grab some data, and bring it back. And that you can see that is if you go to my website and type in .netlify/functions/Instagram stories, that will return to you the pieces of data that I have. In our case, I just want the display URL, which is going to be the full res Instagram story. And then it also gives you a preview, which this is a base 64 encoded JPEG. So let me go to my Instagram component real quick and show you that. I found this code on Stack Overflow. Basically, this is not the entire JPEG. It needs to be mashed up somehow with this code right here. And what that does is it brings to you a 22 pixel wide version of it without having to download any images. So what I do on my website is I'll show you the footer here. Watch, you can see it load real quickly. They're fuzzy for a second. And if you see this URL, if you see this image without a URL, you'll see how that got a little bit fuzzy. That's because that's just I've put the background of that image to be the base 64 because that will load right away. And then as the image is downloading for the user, then it'll clear up and get a little bit more. You see, if I hover over top of it, this is not a URL to anywhere. It's just base 64, 23 by 42 pixels of that. So I thought that was kind of cool. Other things I did is I used this thing. This is just a random website in the Netherlands that resizes your images for free. I don't know how they afford it, but I'm using it because it's just my Instagram. I don't care. And what you do is you hit this URL and pass it your original URL as well as width and height and all that information, and it will resize it on the fly. Cloudinary does something like that as well. And the reason why I did that is, one, I needed these images to be much smaller than they actually are. You saw how big they were. Like, look at this. It's 1080 pixels wide. That's way too big to put into here. So I use this to resize it to 100 pixels high. And second, almost everybody is blocking Instagram and Facebook and things like that, especially if they're using Firefox. So these images would never load on most developers' websites because they're using ad blockers to block Instagram and Facebook. And also, I don't want Instagram's greedy little tracking fingers on my website, and embedding an image will allow them to do that. So by proxying it through this resizer, that just gets rid of all of it. I also did that with my Instagram posts right here, as well as my Twitter images that go in here. It allows me to resize it as well as get Instagram's little fingers out of there. I did a similar thing with the Instagram photos. I know they have an API, but it's too hard to work with. They don't approve you right away, things like that. So I just went for the back alley version of it, and I just scraped them and brought them right back in. The syntax latest podcast gets pulled in. The reason why I'm not doing that on build time is because the podcast comes out twice a week, and if my website's not rebuilding at the exact time the podcast is released, and that is out of date. So fetching that on the client side rather than statically generated, it was a good choice in that regard. In our case here, I just added a little endpoint to, we go here, podcast. This is the URL here. If I open that up, you see we just have a little API endpoint. I had to enable cores on the Syntax website, and this pulls in information about the latest podcast, and that's rendered out into the bottom there. This is hard coded. I don't release a course that often. That needs to be dynamic, so I'll update that when I release a new course. What else? I took all of my hot tips from Twitter and embedded them into my website. And I didn't do anything all that interesting for this. I just downloaded my Twitter archive, and then if you go to GitHub, Wes Boss, there is a scrape tips.js. And basically what this did is it just got them all, and then downloaded all of the images from the tweet from twitter.com, because that's something that doesn't come along with your download. See a little function called download image here. And then it made a directory based on that tip and then saved it in there. This was a bit of a pain in the butt. The same thing with my blog posts. Not all of my blog posts were in Markdown, so some of them needed to be and some of them needed not to be. Some of my blog posts had HTML in them, which they shouldn't have. So I wrote this massive ugly function just to replace random stuff in my HTML blog posts. Things just like random spans that WordPress put in there. So that took about, 4 or 5 hours to write that. And finally, I got all of them being pulled in. And I grabbed that via the JSON API. The pagination for this was kind of fun to do. I've got videos on building the pagination here. You'll see, look at this. You see these images they sort of blur themselves in. I'm on a super slow connection right here. That's why it's a little bit slow, but you see how they blur themselves in? That's because Gatsby image saves a very small base 64 for you and then stretches it and blurs it. And then when the download is actually finished, it will blur it in, and it only does it on demand, which allows the site to have that really fast, snappy feeling, which is pretty cool. Formatting. I formatted the HTML. So if you view source, this is really cool. Let me show you the link to it. Basically, if you view source on any of my websites, you get to see the nicely formatted. By default, Gatsby will compact it all. And I didn't want that because I wanted people to be able to view source and see what's going on in it. So like you see like what's going on here. Well, this is the critical CSS. The first thing Gatsby does is it figures out what CSS is needed to render the page without a bunch of jank. And it puts that before any of the content in a style tag, which is pretty cool. Then we have all of our meta tags. Here's a good example. I have this open graph function here. This is a serverless function that generates my open graph meta tag. This is a bad example. That's broken. But if I were to maybe look at another one, you could see there's an image and there's a logo in the corner, things like that. That's using headless Chrome, which is called Puppeteer, and that just takes a screenshot of an actual image. I laid this all out with HTML and CSS, and then it just takes a screenshot and saves it as a PNG, which is pretty nifty. What was I showing you before that? Oh yeah, all the meta tags are generated. Post meta tag. Here we go. So all of them, these are generated by myself. This is kind of a downside to using, I think, Gatsby versus WordPress is a lot of this comes for free, and I had to go and do that myself. But I think it's worth it. And then you see the body and all the nav and everything that's in here. Pretty cool that Gatsby does this. So the what's it called? The plugin that I use, if I go to my blog post here, here we go. James Vickery. I just like tweeted, I'm like, hey, like, is there an option in Gatsby to like not compact the HTML? And they said, no, that's just what React gives us. And then this guy, the nicest guy ever, made a freaking Gatsby plugin that just runs the outputted HTML through Prettier, and then gives you this nice view source, which I thought was so cool, to be able to do that. And I was also just trying to debug the output, the build output, because I was having some issues, and having it nicely formatted like this was key. Pagination formatting. What else about this? It's hosted on Netlify. So these serverless functions are just running on AWS Lambda. So if I ever decided to go to not Netlify, I could just host these serverless functions on any other Lambda host, which is pretty cool. It builds. Oh yeah, that's the sort of the downside to this, is that it's slow as heck to build. So I've got, I don't know, maybe 500 pages, about 350 images on here. And every time Gatsby hits one of these images, it resizes it to a number of different sizes. You can see there's a bunch of different sizes in here. And in order to do that with Gatsby, it has to resize them all for you. And in my build, like, it's not a huge website. It was taking like 25 minutes. So two solutions I had is Gatsby Cloud, which will do incremental builds. So if you just change one page, there's no sense in rebuilding the entire website. And then Netlify, it does cache the images for you, but it still takes a while. So I'm using this experimental thing called Netlify or Gatsby Parallel Build. And what that does is it just, instead of resizing them on one machine, it just puts all the images out to, I think, Google Cloud, and lets all of their computers work on each one individually. And then it waits for all of them to come back. And that sort of takes the heavy lifting of image resizing and gives it to thousands of little computers to do it. And that sped it up quite a bit. Build time went from like 25 minutes down to 6 or 7. So I'm looking at about like 11 minutes in terms of build and deploy with Netlify right now, which is still, it's okay for some people. For me, I feel like it's a little bit slow. So we'll see what Gatsby Cloud was a little bit quicker than that. I'm not sure why I went with Netlify. I just didn't have enough time to totally get into it all, but I'm hoping that gets much faster in the future. Yeah, so that's the site. Had a lot of fun building it. It's totally open source. If you want to jump into it and see how it works and run it yourself, all that good stuff, check it out. GitHub, Wes Boss. Hopefully you enjoyed that tour, and I'll catch you later.